Applåd till Octavia Randolph.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lars Kursla, for the invitation to come and speak to you. I'm thrilled and delighted to be here. How is your week been going? Good? I'm having a fantastic week myself, so I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for coming. Again, I am Octavia Randolph. I am an American of English descent, and I write novels set in 9th century England and set here on Gotland. And I also live here in Visby now. So for the purposes of this talk, which is about battle tactics in the 9th century, I will be referring to the English both by that name and as Anglo-Saxons and Saxons, and I shall use the terms Scandinavian and Norse interchangeably. You will also hear me use the term Viking in this talk, but I want to note that historically, this term was virtually unknown in the English language. The Anglo-Saxons in England, suffering from Viking attacks, rarely used that word. The Old English poem commemorating the Battle of Maldon, fought in 991, uses it to refer to the invaders, but that is actually unusual. It was also a rarely used term in Old Norse. None of the picture stones in this building uses the term Viking, for example, even when they were raised in honor of men who died on raids. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the main source and a quite reliable one for the history of the time, was created during the reign of the King of Wessex, Alfred, who died in the year 899. The Chronicle refers to the raiders by 3 names: the Danes, the Great Army, and my personal favorite, the Heathen Horde. So this is an abridged version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And you're more than welcome to come up and look at anything that I have up here. This is fascinating because it's written in the Old English it was originally recorded in, and then side by side you'll see the transliteration in modern English. So please don't hesitate to come up and look at it. So this is our major source for the time period. So we are going to be talking about the Danish war groups that were attacking and plundering England with such efficiency in the 9th century, and how the Saxons fought back. Though both Norwegians and Swedes took part in later raids in England, in the 9th century, those attacking there were nearly all Danes. At the same time, the Norwegians were sailing over the north of the landmass of Britain and attacking Ireland, where they founded Dublin. And the Swedes, the Svir, were largely involved in traveling east up the Dnieper and Volga rivers to the Black and Caspian Seas, trading furs and slaves for silk and spices. In the year 871, which is when my novels begin, a 22-year-old was named King of Wessex. His name was Alfred, and his father and his 3 brothers had been king before him, but all had died. Wessex was one of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which under pressure from the Danes would, in just the next few years, collapse to 4 and finally only 1 kingdom, that of Wessex under Alfred. So he faced a formidable challenge: the very survival of the English way of life, the Christianity it had embraced, the English language, and so on. All was at grave risk. Prior to this risk, there was no actual idea of England as a united entity, just kingdoms oftentimes at war with each other. Desperation helped forge the identity that became Angleland, the home of the Angles. And as you can see, if you take Angleland, you can quickly condense it to be England. Just like my books, I am representing both sides here. I'm dressed as a 9th century Norse woman, but the battle flag that we'll be talking about a little bit later is a Saxon flag, very similar to the one perhaps that King Alfred's men would have carried into battle, when we'll be talking about the importance of battle flags a little later on. We know a lot about how the Saxons fought as they recorded their battles. They had monks in monasteries recounting events in both Latin and Old English. They were writing in ink. on lambskin parchment, all in all a very nimble and effective way to preserve information. We know far less about how the attacking Danes fought because, of course, they had only runes carved into wood and stone to write with, which is a comparatively cumbersome manner, and they had no single educated class of scholars to describe events as a public record. So their battle tactics are also mainly recorded in the Saxon Chronicle. Warring was a summertime activity only until the great army, made up of mostly Danes but a few Norwegians and Svir, overwintered in England in 865. Prior to that date, the pattern had been that the Danes would sail across the North Sea in the summertime to raid, grabbing what they could, and quickly retreat home while the sailing was still good. Some of these war bands were quite small, 20 to 60 men, under a single chief, a band which would raid on its own or possibly join up with another raiding band that they found there. But their modus operandi was to grab silver and slaves and sail back home. But then they decided to stay in the green, fertile, and heavily forested land that they had been plundering. England was rich and quite underpopulated by Danish standards. In order to stay, they needed something much more difficult to obtain than silver and slaves. They needed land to settle on. Young Alfred was a skillful military leader, so let's look at the structure of his army, or fyrd, as it's called in Old English. It was set up originally for this approximately 6 months when you could expect to be fighting. That is during the late spring, during the summer, and the early autumn, when the sailing was safest, and thus the threat of attack from the Vikings was the greatest. Alfred's fyrd, or army, consisted of 3 months on active duty, so that no man was away from home for more than that time period, and so he could attend to the agricultural and domestic responsibilities of his home. So 3 months in the field, and then 3 months back at home. The composition of the fyrd was the king himself, and then later on, when he was old enough, his son, Edward, the prince, or in smaller units, a lord with trained warriors, professional warriors, which were called thanes, supported by churls, who were simple freemen, lightly armed. The thanes were the heavily armed men who fought with spears, swords, and shields. The churls were armed with spears and shields, or bows and arrows. There were important bonds of loyalty between Anglo-Saxon leaders and their men. They were deeply interdependent, as kings and princes and lords were responsible for distributing goods and weapons and horses to their best warriors, and warriors in return would give the choicest things they plucked off the battlefield and present them to their lord. So it was a circle of treasure going around. Vows of loyalty unto death were quite common in the English world, and we know of instances in which men did not desert the battlefield even when they could have, but fought on to the very last man because their lord had been slain. The English fought in what we call the shield wall, that is, men armed with shields in their right hands and shields in their left hands, and spears and swords in their right hands. So oftentimes those shields were, of course, held so closely to each other that the rims could have touched. There is an Old English word for shield wall, wihaga, which literally means war hedge, which really sort of demonstrates the barrier that was created behind this row of shields. The shield wall is, of course, an ancient battle formation. It was used by the Greek hoplites and the Roman legions. They would advance in this formation and brace themselves to withstand an attack. But the Danish Vikings greatly preferred much looser guerrilla-style raids, swiftly sailing up a beach or onto a river, jumping from the ship, attacking a farm. If they were on land, Danes were very good at traveling quickly through the woodland in open order, and then approaching quietly to a settlement, forming up quickly, inciting panic in the residents as they killed and captured people, grabbed food stores, animals, and other valuables, and quickly fled back to their boats. The most terrifying part of this, of course, for the Christians of Angleland, was that the complete disregard that the Danes showed for church property and persons. All monasteries and convents and churches had silver in the way of altar plate and communion cups, and convents had women as well. It was appalling to the English that monks and priests were killed and nuns were raped or captured. It was one of the biggest reasons that when Alfred finally made peace with Guthrum, the king of the Danes, in England, after a huge pitched battle and siege in 878, which the Saxons won, Alfred insisted that Guthrum and his chief men be baptized. They wanted the Danes to learn to honor church property and clergy. Well, the Viking warriors, of course, had war chiefs they respected and followed, and Guthrum, who became the king of the Danes in England, was himself of royal blood. He was the nephew of the Danish king Horik. Viking war chiefs also rewarded their men with treasure. That is a Germanic tradition practiced by both the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse. But in the 9th century at least, raiding for the Norse seems to have been very much every man for himself. We have no evidence of Norse warriors pledging to defend the chief unto death. For most war bands, the chief was the man who owned the ship who brought them to England. To the Norse, raiding was always very closely allied with trading, and both were essentially commercial ventures. If they wanted to return home, keeping the ship owner alive was a good strategy. So we're going to look at a few pictures now. We've been looking at a map of the body of England in the year 865, the year that the great heathen army landed and stayed over the winter. You can see a number of different kingdoms here, which were Saxon kingdoms. So Northumbria, Lindesay is in here, it's not pointed out, but East Anglia, Mercia, and of course Wessex. So at this point, Alfred's older brother was king of Wessex. But you see the number of different kingdoms that we have in 865. And now we are going to fast forward just 13 years. This is after the Battle of Wedmore, in which Alfred and Guthrum literally divided Britain up through this. It's called the Danelaw. It starts in London along Watling Street and goes all the way up. All the red area is now Danish territory. And you see essentially one kingdom, Mercia here, which was being ruled by Alfred's brother-in-law, and Wessex down here. So it was a really, really dramatic political change. So we're looking now at two elite warriors side by side. This is the Saxon Thane, and this would be the Norse Viking. These men are rich, as all of you will immediately know by looking at them, by the way that they are equipped. They own swords. At first glance, they actually look pretty similar. The sea axe, the distinctive knife that the Saxons used, it's right there, and which gave its name to the Saxons, sea axe, Saxon, and the skegox, or the bearded axe that the Norse guys carrying, were sort of about the greatest differences in their equipment. The sea axe was worn on a belt directly across the stomach, making the hilt easy to grasp. And the Danes tended to hang their knives from their weapons belts on their hip. The other difference is the baldric here. Many Saxon thanes, not all of them, but many of them would actually suspend the baldric from the right shoulder. And you see there's a buckle there. So you could actually pull that up so the hilt would be quite high on the chest. So if you were on horseback or you were like running through the woods or underbrush, the tip did not get caught so easily. So it was actually a very clever way to keep the sword out of your way when you need to move quickly. The Danes always wore their swords on their weapons belts, and typically if they were right-handed, it would be obviously on the left hip. So, spears, beloved of Odin and Woden, were the primary weapon of both the Saxons and the Norse. Spears were generally made of ash. They were between 2 meters to over 3 meters in length, 6 to 11 feet. Here we see the lighter throwing spears, as well as the larger thrusting spears. A good sword was the professional warrior's most cherished possession, and these were obviously very often family heirlooms. Swords were given names on both sides. Both the Norse and the Saxons oftentimes would name their swords, names which could be inscribed on the blade itself, although some warriors would keep the name secret for magical reasons. Some sword names have come down to us. There's a sword in the British Museum which is named Echo Swari, which means increase to pain or augmenter of pain. And we know of Viking swords named Rushing Harm and Golden Hilt. So design of the swords varied slightly between the Danes and the Saxons, especially the pommel, which is the terminal end of the hilt. Most Saxon swords were between 76 and 84 centimeters, or 30 to 33 inches long, and Norse swords were sometimes longer than that. Here's 4 exceptionally beautiful Swedish swords. So the hilt is worn away. You're just seeing the iron tang there, but of course the hilt would have been wood or bone, sometimes covered over with leather to increase the grip. But these pommels are just exquisite. So those are spear swords from the time period. And this is probably the most beautiful Anglo-Saxon sword pommel that we have. It's also in the British Museum. It is silver and gold. And you can see it's different on both sides. Beautiful, beautiful design. You can understand why these were family heirlooms and how precious they were. So, men fighting with swords, of course, was always a minority, whether on raids or in pitched battles. If you owned a sword, you also could likely afford defensive equipment, such as a helmet and chainmail, a ring shirt, as they were called. These 3 items in particular distinguish the elite warrior: sword, helmet, and ring shirt. These are items which you bought, were passed down to you through the family, or if you were a good fighter, you stripped off the body of a better armed man that you killed on the battlefield. And of course, you could be given weapons and defensive equipment by your war chief as a reward for good service. This is, will be familiar to you. This is the famous English embroidery made to commemorate the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And the reason I'm showing it to you is down in the border. You can see what's going on here. These men are being stripped of everything. These ring shirts are being pulled off of them. Their shoes are gone. They are left absolutely naked. So this was the type of booty gathering that went on typically after all battles and skirmishes, is that you took everything from your enemy. And this was so well recorded here that I had to show it to you. So, lacking the options of the ring shirts that these men are plundering, most men had to make do with far less equipment. Instead of a steel helmet, they might have hardened leather war caps to protect their heads. Leather that has been wet and then formed into shape will become quite hard and will really provide decent protection. A few of these have actually survived, and they have thin iron bands stripped over, like 4 bands, to sort of give them extra support. Leather tunics, of course, were worn both under the ring shirts and alone for those who could not afford mail. This is an Anglo-Saxon sea axe, absolutely stunning. Again, you're seeing the naked tang here. The hilt is gone. This is called the sitting-born sea axe. And this sort of a knife is called a broken back knife because the back of the knife just drops off to this very severe point. This was the typical knife that all Saxons carried. This one actually has a wonderful inscription. It says, "Sigbert owns me," And on the back, Bjerthert, who was the blade smith, actually carved his name in the back on the other side of the blade. So it's quite a fearsome knife, quite an impressive knife that the Saxons were carrying. Here's a drawing of some typical Norse battle axes. The one that was most used in England was this one right here, again, the skegox, which was particularly fierce because of the hooking. It's called a bearded axe in English as well. And here's those axes in action. This is a carving made after the attack on the monastery in Lindisfarne, an early attack in Britain that happened in 793. And you see these men, here's their swords and here's their axes, where they just demolished, they burnt the monastery, they slaughtered the monks. What's very interesting here is in the Viking encampment in Medeltidsveckan marketplace there, you will see a corselet very similar to what these men are wearing, this layered kind of armor sewn together. And so I thought that was really, really fun that you've actually got on display in the Viking portion of the encampment that. There were also rarely used weapons like the warhammer, which must have occurred in both cultures, as we do have some early English hammer amulets. The English warhammers had kind of long, thin hammers, like a builder's hammer, but the Norse tended to be stumpier, more like the hammer of Thor. And again, for offensive equipment, second-tier warriors, because we've been looking at the kit of elite warriors. Second-tier warriors would have spears and shields or bows and arrows to fight with. So how are we repelling all these weapons? Nearly all fighters obviously had shields. So this is an actual early shield that has survived. It is from the Gotland ship in Norway. It's about 900, and it was beautifully preserved. So you can actually see the structure of it and the boss in the middle. So this is the back of the shield, and this is the front. So shields needed to be lightweight, resistant to splitting, and very tough. The typical shield material was alder, willow, poplar, or birch, although for some reason in poetry we oftentimes hear of linden or limewood shields as well, but what we have of the remains of shields is it's a less frequently used wood. 3 to 9 slats of wood were used to build up the disc, more pieces being common in the Norse shields. The Anglo-Saxon shields tend to be made up of fewer pieces of wood. So Saxon shields were always covered over with cowhide leather, which was wet and then would shrink to consolidate and strengthen the boards. It's also possible that shields were actually padded with a leather lining, which would have been very useful for instances in which the shield was large enough for the warrior to brace his knee against the inside. So we have a couple of archaeological finds that suggest that the interior of shields could be leather covered as well. So the iron bosses there could definitely be weapons in of themselves. It's a really good drawing of typical Anglo-Saxon shield bosses. So again, for those of you who not usually fighting with shields, your hand goes inside the grip there. That's the outside of the shield. But these conical shaped bosses on the outside could absolutely be used, offensively, because shields did get splintered down to next to nothing. But if you had that in your hand, and some of these bosses actually had spikes on the end, you could punch right through a man's mail shirt and kill him with that. So shield bosses were a very, very important part of the shields because they tended to last when the shield itself would be fragmented into nothing. So compared to a sword, bows and arrows were low status weapons as they were used for hunting and easily made at home. Any homesmith could forge effective arrowheads. And remember, in those days, every farm had a forge. Every farmer was expected to be able to make simple tools and weapons like arrowheads and spear points. As an indication of the status of the bow, a Northumbrian hostage was allowed to use bow and arrows at the Battle of Maldon in the year 991 to fight against the Vikings for his host. So this was an Englishman who was being held hostage by another English family, but when they were attacked by a common enemy, he fought with them against the Vikings, but they did not give him a sword, they gave him a bow and arrow. Nevertheless, the longbow could be pretty impressive. The Helvey stone, which is downstairs, shows two Gotlandic men with their longbows. I particularly like this stone because you see the woman standing between them. These men are not in an offensive position, and it's almost as if she stopped them from fighting. And I like that very much. So let's talk now about how battles were actually fought. We know from the sagas recorded in Iceland that battlegrounds and dueling grounds could be ritually designated by the use of branches from the hazelwood tree. Marking the ground in this way reminds us of the notion that battle itself was almost a sacred act, something that required a uniquely separate space set apart from everyday life. The dueling ground or the battlefield truly was a no man's land. So hazel wands would be used to mark that off. In a practical sense, of course, for a pitched battle where you have two sides facing each other, a narrow site where the shield wall could be compact was preferred, as was higher ground looking down on the enemy, forcing them to rush up towards you. And that brings us to the roles of various fighters. We know from textual reports and contemporary illustrations that smaller men, younger men, did not take part in the shield walls directed by Saxon war leaders. The largest and the strongest men stood in the shield wall, armed with spears or swords. Youths and smaller men flung javelins or were archers and sling throwers, hurling round river stones in leather slings. This is a drawing from the Bayeux Tapestry, and I'm showing it to you because it very clearly depicts this. So this is the Saxon line, and you see these big warriors. And look at this man right up front here, the archer. He's depicted much, much smaller than the big, heavy fighting man. And we see this over and over again in English illustrations, that young boys, teenagers even, or smaller men were using bows and arrows or using slings. The other thing I want to point out is the battle flags here, because we're going to talk about battle flags soon. So each of these two Saxon contingents have a battle flag. Here's 3 Norse battle flags, depictions of them. The top 2, this one and this one, were taken from coins minted in Jorvik, modern-day York, and some of you may have been to Jorvik. And this one is also taken from the Bayeux Tapestry. And what's fascinating to me is that is a bird, and I think that even as late as Battle of Hastings was, that these were Normans, but they were channeling the raven banner to have this bird there. It's one of the banners that they use there. So, the king or the lord's bodyguard, his picked men, would of course be armed with swords. For Alfred's army, there would be the shield wall in front of him, possibly more than one line deep, and then his personal bodyguard, but always close enough to the action that he could shout commands and encouragement. Great war leaders and kings were active participants in battles, though it was hoped that their personal bodyguard would not be breached and require that to happen. We know that they were active participants in battles because so many kings died that way. Many, many kings in the era were left on the battlefield dead. Once the parties met up, there was oftentimes a final challenge with demand for silver from the Danes. This was an extortionary offer to leave without fighting in exchange for treasure. Over the years, 25,000 pounds, that's 11,000 kilos of silver, was paid by Ethelwulf, Alfred's father, and his 3 sons, and his 4th son, Alfred, to the Danes so that they would not have to fight. 11,000 kilos of silver. Think of that. They were very, very good at extracting treasure just with the threat. These payments even had their own name because there were special taxes raised for them, Danegeld. Just parenthetically, let me say that more Anglo-Saxon coins have been found here on Gotland than have ever been found in Britain. However, to reassure us of how peaceful Gotland has typically been, despite 1361, most of those Anglo-Saxon coins came here in trade with Danes. They were trading coins, not raiding coins. So we will assume that that offer has been made and it has been rejected. No, we are going to fight. In readiness, the horses and the supply wagons would be taken to the rear and kept under guard. A battle horn of animal horn or brass would be sounded, conveying orders to form up, and as the battle went on, also to advance or to retreat. So the men lined up in their battle formation, calling out taunts, essentially swearing at each other across the distance. So the two armies, again, there's still a space between them. The final element was always the war cry by the leader, the last sound before the charge, before action commenced. The war cry could be the name of a king or their war chief. It could be the name of the shire or kingdom or the name of God or a god. We don't know if the Norse used war cries in the same formal way that the Saxons did, but for the Saxons it was an important last exclamation before the attack. First would come the missiles, so the lightweight throwing spears, archers aiming with arrows, the use of the slings. These would hit the enemy shield wall, hit behind them, possibly hit the heads and unprotected arms and legs of the opposing forces. Men could be injured and killed and go down right then. The missile throwers would let go that volley and then run to the back. And those throwing spears and those arrows were, of course, picked up by the other side and thrown right back as well. The real fighting, however, was always the brute force of the two sides of men with spears and shields or swords and shields colliding. The Danes would sometimes use the boar snout formation, Sindhilking, to puncture the shield wall. This was a wedge-shaped formation with your two best champions in front, like the tusks of a boar, and then ranks of 3, 5, 9 men behind them to try to puncture right through, moving with great force, so that to puncture the shield wall and to provoke the general melee that would follow. The boar snout formation, however, has its own dangers because it is so compact. It could be surrounded. So they didn't always use that unless they had sufficient men to really broaden it at its very base there. Once contact is made, however you've come together, all formations will, of course, disintegrate, and that is where the general hand-to-hand fighting begins, which is where the battle is won or lost. We have heard about the structure of Alfred's army, so we'll talk a bit about the Viking war cults, the men who took on the attributes of wild animals like bear, wolves, or boar. We must note that record of these cults post-date the actual Viking age. But there is little doubt that the idea of channeling the ferocity of a wild animal as you entered battle was highly attractive, especially as the Norse, in particular, believed in shape-shifting for both men and women. These cult warriors donned the skins of their totemic animals for berserker, bear shirts, ulfhelder, wolf coats. They were known for their complete fearlessness and even recklessness in battle. And both of these qualities are extremely intimidating to the opponent. Boars were also used as totemic animals and are found on the helmets of both English and Norse warriors. Spears were used for thrusting at the enemy, trying to hit any vulnerable body part left unprotected by the round shield, the head, shoulder, thighs, calves, or feet. It takes a great deal of one-arm strength to successfully control and thrust a spear that is 2 to 3 meters long. You can get much more purchase by gripping the spear with both hands, but then your own body is unprotected. Swords, of course, were used for hacking and slashing, battering the rim of the enemy's shield, trying to get a hit on the open right arm and shoulder, and any other place that an agile man could strike. Some of you are reenactors, and you know the sheer energy it takes to engage your opponent, keep swinging, avoid his own hacking slashes, all the while trying to stay aware of what is going on either side of you, where your own men are, and where your battle flag is. We know from poetry and other accounts that temporary truces could be called on the battlefield, while men would have their wounds bound up, found unbroken weapons or new shields, and got a drink. We also know that men would literally pull their ring shirts off to save their strength and to give them more speed. So let's talk now about the importance of the battle flag or banner. Can you all see this? Okay. Remember that warriors had no standardized uniforms to identify them to either friends or enemies. And communication on the field of battle was limited to verbal commands, the use of the blast horn, and the visual of the battle flag. The flag always stayed close by the king or the war leader, and it was vitally important to signal that he and his bodyguard were still alive and intact. The flag would be entrusted to one man, oftentimes a youth, who, because he was holding the flag, could use no weapons. It was a very dangerous job. If he got killed, and he oftentimes did get killed, another man had to pick up the flag and hold it aloft. The downing of the battle flag, the loss of the battle flag, these were nearly always catastrophic events and generally signaled defeat. There was great shame on both sides if your flag was captured. After a battle was over and the surviving victors went ranging around collecting booty from the men that had been killed, the enemy's battle flag would be a real prize to give to your war leader. The Danes used a raven on their flag, a bird associated with Odin, and one also associated with feasting on the bodies of the fallen. The raven was potently symbolic to both sides in these wars. It's always been very interesting to me that Wessex used a dragon, a mythological creature, while the Danes used a bird that all of the men had actually seen in real life. But even amongst educated men in the 9th century, men who had never seen a dragon, they believed that dragons had once existed and possibly still did exist, guarding mounds of treasure deep underground. The raven banner of the Danes fell in battle prior to them losing an important battle with Wessex. I'm citing the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle here for the year 878, as it is significant that this fact was recorded, so powerful was the banner thought to be. And in this same winter, a brother of Ivar and Halfdan was in Wessex, in Devon, and there he was slaying, and 800 men with him, and 40 men of his retinue. And there the banner, which they called Raven, was captured. We think that this slain brother was Ubba. The retinue, of course, was his personal bodyguard, so this gives you an idea that a great war leader would have 40 men protecting him. And this Ubba was the brother of Ivar the Boneless, and both Ubba and Ivar, of course, were sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. So the Danes had the raven, and the Saxons of Wessex had a golden dragon of Alfred. Possibly it looked like this one. This is a banner which I embroidered many years ago, inspired by a dragon in the border of the famous Bayeux Tapestry, which commemorates the Battle of Hastings. These banners on both sides of the battle would have been woven and embroidered by mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters. The Raven banner, which fell in the battle with Wessex we just spoke about, was woven by the sisters of Uba and Ivar. There must have been hundreds of battle flags created over the years, but none of them have survived. Only visual depictions of them, such as I showed you from the coins or on the Bayeux Tapestry. So when the battle finally turns and there's the critical decision whether to run after the fleeing enemy, abandoning your fellow wounded and all the booty that's lying there, or to stay put. We know at least once that Saxon troops ran after retreating Danes, only to have the Danes turn on them and again attack, routing them and literally destroying them. So it was very, very tricky. Commanders usually wanted to keep their men on the field and not run after the fleeing enemy, just for that reason, because it could be a trick. But in the aftermath of the real victory comes the stripping of the bodies, taking weapons, defensive equipment, jewelry, purses, even shoes and clothing. As we saw in that slide from the Bayeux Tapestry, men would literally be stripped of everything and be left naked. Now, I want to say just a few words about female warriors. There is no record in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of any woman, either Saxon or Norse, fighting during the Danish incursion. Alfred's own daughter, Ethelfled, who was married to the Lord of Mercia, commanded the forces of Mercia herself with great ability after her husband's death. But there is no record of her actually attending the battles, let alone participating in them. Women, of course, have been written out of history repeatedly, but we must lay aside depictions of women Viking warriors that television serves up with such reckless abandon. Such imagery is a 21st century projection of modern aspirational gender roles cast back into time, a time which in fact had quite rigidly determined sex roles. So I'll be speaking at length about this topic in October here in another lecture. But having said that, let us just briefly touch on the Berka grave, BJ 581, which is an early 10th century grave whose occupant was reevaluated using DNA testing, and the results were revealed in 2017. This was a grand warrior's grave in a major sphere trading center, Berka, a body that was buried with a sword, battle axe, spear, shield, arrows, 2 sacrificed horses, bows and arrows, and stirrups for the horses. Although the grave was first excavated in the 1880s, this recent testing by bioarchaeologists found that the bones from this grave to be that of a woman. So why would a woman be buried with such weaponry if she was not using it? Well, both the Saxons and the Norse placed great traditional, material, and ritual value in the significance of weaponry. The Roman historian and senator Cornelius Tacitus, in his report Germania, which he wrote about the year 98, notes that women not only received weaponry as a dowry, but they were expected to preserve and protect it for coming generations. This could have been family treasure she was buried with, as the last of a line. There were no wounds on the skeleton indicating battle injuries, but many men have been buried with weapons who also had no perceptible wounds. This may have been a powerful woman who, like Ethelfled, Alfred's very capable daughter, was a skillful tactician and an inspiring leader. But unless they were in extreme situations, it is highly unlikely that such women engaged directly in battle with male troops. Women just can't fight in hand-to-hand combat with shield and sword against men and have any real chance of survival. Having said that, let's think back to her war kit she was buried with and focus on the bows and arrows and her horses. Women are just as good archers as men, and if they are mounted, it gives great mobility against ground troops. If she was using those weapons, I will bet it was as an archer. The bottom line is we just don't know enough, and until we do, we need to try to restrain our desire to again project our modern expectations and aspirations of female behavior back then. So, to sum up, it is really impossible to judge who were actually the better warriors, the Saxons or the Vikings. Certainly the Danes were extraordinarily intimidating at the beginning of their attacks and amazingly good at extorting huge amounts of silver from the English to go away. Both sides adopted the other's techniques, and Alfred even built a navy to try to frustrate the dragon ships of the Danes. The Danish Vikings very nearly conquered all of England. It was a very close thing. But in the critical pitched battles, the Saxons, who were after all defending their homeland, often won. The Battle of Ethandune, won by Alfred against Guthrum's forces in 878, the slide I showed you with the huge red Danish territory, that led to the partition of England. That is one such example, as was the very last Viking battle fought by the English in 1066, the Battle of Stamford Bridge in the north of England, where the Viking forces of Harald Hardrada arrived in 300 ships and went back to Norway in 24. That was real slaughter. So to sum up, I want to really thank my friend Steve Pollington, who's a really renowned Anglo-Saxon scholar, and his book, The English Warrior, has been a major source for me for many years, and he graciously allowed me to use many of the drawings for his book. So I want to thank Steve. And I want to thank you so much for your attention and interest. I'm happy to speak to you. Please come up and look at anything. I have bookmarks and postcards and things for you to take, and would love to speak with you. If you have any questions, I'm ready to take them. Thank you. You're such a knowledgeable crowd. You don't have any. Aha, back there.
Yeah, we were wondering when we look back in time, for example, with Hannibal, they talk a great deal about different tactics that he used. But was that also back then in time, or was it just two shield wars against each other and just the more skillful fighters or the more number that would actually win the battle?
It actually tended to be pretty rigid, and it was really eye-opening for the Saxons to come across a much more free-form kind of battle that these small Danish raiding parties went into. Because when the Anglo-Saxons were fighting against each other, it was quite formalized. I mean, they'd agree on where to meet. They'd form up. They'd try to have a last-minute parley to see if they could not fight. But then they would usually fight, and it was very, very ritualized and formalized. So, yeah, that is the way that they typically would fight. But the Danes came in, there were very small groups of men, and so it was much easier for them just to find unprotected targets, take what they wanted, and leave. But there were finally so many of them, and they wanted to stay in England, then they really had to engage in a pitched battle. Thank you.
Do we have any records of use of mercenaries by the Saxons?
By the Saxons, yes, we do, but there seem to have been few and far between. There were definitely, because Alfred had tried to set up the army so it wasn't punitive, so that men were only away for 3 months at a time. That really kept that, and they were, of course, fed. They weren't armed. Men had to arm themselves, but they were fed. So that tended to keep the others down. Where we have the mercenary side was more on the Danes, because they hired the Welsh. So, which was pretty scary, because of course Wales is right behind the body of England. So, so the Welsh were oftentimes in cahoots with the Danes, because the Welsh hated the English as well. So, pardon me?
How about the Strathclyde?
I'm sorry?
The kingdom of Strathclyde, north.
Oh, it's Strathclyde.
Yeah.
Yeah, about mercenaries there?
Yeah.
I don't know anything specific about, are you talking to a certain people group, like a certain ethnic group that
Did they participate on those battles?
Oh yes. I mean, I'm sure that there were absolutely, and as the Danes had gotten settled, further north, and Jorvik and all of that were settled, there were absolutely Englishmen who went over to their side. Yes. Yes.
Do we know anything about those who fought and were wounded but survived? I mean, there must have been people who couldn't continue fighting. What happened to those?
That's true. Just an awful lot of guys died, from their wounds. That blood poisoning. It was not a good thing to get wounded. And of course, we know from looking at skeletons that men were wounded and healed and lived to fight again, and either died of old age or they died in another battle. But you really did not want to get hurt, because it was pretty hard to survive. And camp conditions were such that there was dysentery, there were all kinds of issues it was tough. Healers were kept busy, So if you had camp followers with skillful healers, that was one of the things, of course, the nuns and monks were very good at, because they were really advanced healers. But you really did not want to get hurt. You either wanted to fight to the death or you wanted to win, because if you were wounded, you were going to die a terrible death from blood poisoning. On that cheerful note. So thank you so much. Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.